Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, earlier this year, my wife and I brought our daughters, Caroline and Catherine, to D.C. for a weekend. Caroline is 6, Catherine's 3. And we brought them to the museum, the wonderful museum that is just a few blocks away from the Capitol. In the front of the building is carved in the granite the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, something that I remember showing both of my daughters as a liberty that we revere. Our Constitution in this country is rightly revered, and among the Constitution, nothing is more revered than the Bill of Rights. And within the Bill of Rights, nothing is more revered than the First Amendment and the protection of free speech. I am sad that we're here today because the effect of this amendment, which to my astonishment and dismay 42 Democrats have signed their name to, is that if adopted, this amendment would repeal the free speech protections of the First Amendment. Now, in over 200 years of our nation's history, we've never amended the Bill of Rights, and yet 42 Democrats are proposing to do so today. You think of the Bill of Rights and you think of the framers who crafted it. You think of Madison, you think of Jefferson, you think of Hamilton. I have to tell you, as I look around this committee, I don't see any Madisons or Jeffersons or Hamiltons. I certainly would not purport to walk in their footsteps. I find it interesting that 42 Democrats think they know better than the framers about the First Amendment. Now, some folks listening in today's hyper-partisan world might be inclined to discount what I'm saying. I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative. In the world of partisan discourse, there's some people that naturally discount whatever the person of the opposing party says. So if you don't believe me, if you are from a different political persuasion, perhaps you might give some heed to the ACLU. The ACLU is not by any stretch of the imagination some crazy right-wing outfit. The ACLU has historically been a tenacious defender of the Bill of Rights. Let me tell you what the ACLU told this hearing in writing. It said the ACLU strongly opposes this amendment because it would, quote, severely limit the First Amendment and lead directly to government censorship of political speech. So if you don't believe me, perhaps you might be given slight pause by the ACLU. The ACLU went on to say, this constitutional amendment, quote, would fundamentally break the Constitution and would endanger civil rights and civil liberties for generations. Now, if you don't believe me, when the ACLU says we're talking about breaking the Constitution, that should give you some pause. Now, what would it mean specifically? Because there's some folks that keep insisting, oh, it is hyperbole. It is exaggeration to say this is repealing the First Amendment. Well, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. This law says Congress can regulate political speech. And the original version that 42 Democrats signed puts no limits whatsoever, gives Congress total authority over all political speech by corporations and individuals. Here are the examples the ACLU gave. I've given a list of examples, but let's go with the ACLU's because some of you may doubt a Republican's list. The ACLU said if the amendment that 42 Democrats signed on became part of the Constitution, Congress would be allowed to restrict the publication of Secretary Hillary Clinton's forthcoming memoir, Hard Choices, were she to run for office. Now, I want to ask each of you, are you in support of a constitutional amendment that gives Congress the ability to ban a book? Because that's what the ACLU just said this amendment would do. Give Congress the authority to say, Hillary Clinton, you can't publish your book. The ACLU also said this amendment would allow Congress to criminalize a blog on the Huffington Post by Gene Karpinski, president of the League of Conservation Voters, not exactly a bunch of right-wingers, that accuses Senator Marco Rubio of being a climate change denier. Now, some of the observers here might agree with that criticism. Whether you do or not, you have a First Amendment right to express it, just as other people have a First Amendment right to disagree. But under this amendment, The members of this committee apparently believe Congress could not just prohibit, the ACLU said criminalize, make it a criminal offense for the Huffington Post to publish that. That should give you real concern. Indeed, the ACLU pointed out that under this amendment proposed by the Democrats, Congress could pass a law regulating this letter by the ACLU for noting that all 41 sponsors of this amendment, which the ACLU opposes, are Democrats. That's what this amendment would do. If you don't believe me, I would encourage every person read the ACLU's letter. If you care about liberty at all, if you believe in free speech, and let me tell you, I believe in the free speech of anybody who would criticize any one of us, from the left, right, up, down, or the middle, to express that speech to your maximum capacity. That is our democratic process. Now, I would note that my colleague, my friend, Chairman Durbin, has introduced a substitute amendment, perhaps in response to the criticism of this original amendment and the astonishing breadth of it. And the substitute amendment does a couple of things. Number one, it adds the word reasonable. So I anticipate in this debate that the chairman will now go and say, well, yes, the first one would let you criminalize all this stuff, but we've added reasonable. So instead of a protection of free speech, your protection is reasonable. If Congress thinks it's reasonable, if you can convince some court somewhere it's reasonable for Congress to regulate it, then it's protected, unless it's not. Of course, we remember there was a time when Congress thought the Alien and Sedition Acts were reasonable because criticizing the federal government on national security was deemed unreasonable. I'll tell you, I'm not content to have your free speech rights protected by the reasonableness of members of Congress, Republicans or Democrats. I have more faith in the Bill of Rights than I do any elected officials. Now, the Second Amendment, or the second change in Chairman Durbin's amendment, responds to the point that I made at the last hearing we had, which is that there's a lot of talk about Citizens United and corporations, and I observed the amendment that was introduced says nothing about corporations. It gives total authority to regulate you, an individual citizen, your speech. So in response, Chairman Durbin added some language giving Congress explicit power to regulate corporations. And indeed, what this proposed amendment says is that Congress can regulate corporations, quote, including by prohibiting such entities from spending money to influence elections. So this is no longer reasonable limitation. This is prohibiting. Now, I see some citizens here who wearing stickers saying they're supportive of this endeavor. There are two arguments that are used in support of this amendment to repeal the free speech protections of the First Amendment. The first argument Chairman Durbin just gave us, which is that money is not speech. And you know, it reminds me back in college of a logic professor who talked about logical fallacies. One of the classic logical fallacies is that humans are mammals. That, of course, does not mean that all mammals are human. And what Chairman Durbin said is not all money is speech. Well, of course not. If you go and purchase an automobile to drive to and from work, that's not speech. Nobody argues it is. That is the essence of attacking a straw man. But saying all money is not speech is a very different thing from proving the core argument that the proponents of this amendment purport to believe, which is that spending money, that some expenditures of money are not speech. Let me give you examples, because I promise you not a single one of you believes that spending money is not speech. I'll give you some examples of the expenditures of money. Printing a pamphlet, whether it was Thomas Paine's Common Sense or the Federalist Papers, that takes money. I'm willing to bet everyone in this room believes printing a pamphlet arguing about political views constitutes speech. Books. I'm willing to say books are speech. Unequivocally, period. Movies. Movies are absolutely speech. Websites, launching a website. Some of you in this hearing room may have a website. I think you can say the most terrible things imaginable about me, and it's your right to do so. And you know what? If you spend $1 to launch that website, which you can't launch a website without spending $1, under the amendment proposed by 42 Democrats, Congress can prohibit you from expressing that. Billboards. TV ads. Radio ads. I'm willing to say those are speech. Those are core speech. If you want to run a radio ad and say Senator Cruz is wonderful or terrible or somewhere in between, that is your free speech right. Yard signs. Quite literally, if a little old lady wants to spend $5 to erect a yard sign, under the original amendment proposed by 42 amendments, Congress could throw her in jail for spending $5 to put a yard sign up that says Senator Dick Durbin is the most wonderful human being on the face of the planet. There is no doubt that the expenditure of money is and always has been critical to effective free speech. The second canard used is, well, corporations are not human beings. Now, that's an amusing way of characterizing it because I'm not aware of any person who's ever made the argument corporations are human beings. Again, this is a logical fallacy that tricks are being played with you. The argument is not that corporations are human beings. The argument is, do corporations have constitutional rights? Now, I'm also willing to bet that every single one of you wearing stickers saying you support this amendment, I'm willing to bet every single one of you disagrees with the proposition the chairman suggested that corporations have no constitutional rights. Simon & Schuster, the book publisher of Hillary Clinton's new book, is a corporation. I'm willing to guess that no one here believes it would be permissible within the First Amendment to say Simon & Schuster cannot publish that book, because they spend vast sums of money to publish that book. The New York Times. Let's suppose, for those of you on the left, let's suppose a Republican supermajority came in, and imagine the most nefarious right-wingers you can imagine. Would any of you, that scared Senator Franken there. Do any of you think that a supermajority of Congress, composed by nefarious right-wingers, could pass a law that says the New York Times may not criticize Republicans? New York Times is a corporation. Let me tell you something. That law would be blatantly unconstitutional. Why? Because the New York Times has constitutional rights, and every one of you agrees with that. So the statement that corporations have no constitutional rights is not just slightly wrong. It is laughingly, objectively, demonstrably false, and every person in this hearing room agrees with that statement. Now, I want to remind you of the effect of Chairman Durbin's amendment. He says explicitly under this amendment that Congress would have the power to prohibit corporations from spending money to influence elections. Let me give you an example of some of the corporations that could be prohibited from saying anything regarding politics. The ACLU. It's a corporation. Under this language, you could prohibit the ACLU may not speak on politics. The NAACP. NAACP is a corporation. Under this language, what could Congress do? Prohibit the NAACP from spending money to influence election. Congress could prohibit the Human Rights Campaign. It could prohibit the Sierra Club, which is a corporation. It could prohibit Planned Parenthood, which is a corporation. It could prohibit the National Education Association and every labor union in America from spending $1 to influence elections, whether on ads or whether organizing union members. This is a union-busting bill proposed by 42 Democrats to give Congress the power, with no constitutional limitations, to make it a crime to spend money on elections. La Raza is a corporation. Under the proposed amendments, you could prohibit La Raza spending any money on elections. Greenpeace, MoveOn.org, the Brady Center for Handgun Violence, the Anti-Defamation League, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Let me say, I have no difficulty saying that every one of those organizations I just listed, and I might note that most of those organizations, by any reasonable interpretation, they're not particular fans of mine. But every one of them has a constitutional right to express their opinions as loudly and effectively as they can in every context, to stand up against any politician who takes them on. That is what our democracy is built on. I want to say something finally. What the 42 Democrats have signed their name to are saying to the citizenry is trust politicians. I see some of y'all who chuckled at the concept that Congress might criminalize unions from acting, might criminalize movies, might criminalize books. There is no dispute, zero, that under the language proposed by the Democrats, it would be entirely constitutional to do so. So your only protection, if you value your free speech rights, is a bunch of politicians in Washington saying, trust me. Let me be very clear. I don't trust politicians in Washington in either party, not with something as vital as liberty. Look, most of the countries in the world, government restricts speech. We just saw in Europe, the European Commission order Google to take down news documents. Why? Because there's no First Amendment in Europe. Our country is unique. It is special. You know, some of the great lions of the Democratic Party, Ted Kennedy, Russ Feingold, the last time Democrats tried this, they stood up and fought to say, defend the First Amendment, defend free speech, don't amend the Bill of Rights. Where are the liberals? Where are the Democrats willing to defend the Bill of Rights? I will tell you, any politician who put his or her name to an amendment taking away the free speech rights of every American, in my view, should be embarrassed. Should be embarrassed to stand up and say, as 42 Democrats have, that they think they are wiser than Madison and Jefferson and Hamilton, and that we should trust elected politicians in Congress to determine what you, the citizens, can say and what you can't. I agree with John Stuart Mill. If you disagree with speech, the best cure for speech is more speech, not empowering Congress to muzzle the citizenry.
Thank you.